everyone, and welcome to the Roll and Rock podcast presents Wreslecast. I am your host, Renee Canis, and I am joined with my regular two co-hosts, Rocky McVeigh
Hey, everybody.
and Roland Robinson.
Hey, everybody.
And this week we present what we think are the greatest wrestling managers of all time, which honestly, in today's wrestling, isn't really a thing anymore.
It's a lost art,
Uh,
sadly.
It is. If you grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you will have heard of most of these names. Majority of them are in the Hall of Fame. So uh, let's get started with our top five countdown. At number five, we have the Mouth of the South, Jimmy Hart.
Roland hates.
I can't stand him.
Not on Roland's list.
Not even a little bit. Not even an honorable mention or anything. I literally cannot stand anything about him at all. I thought he had a horrible gimmick. I hated the sound of his voice. Just didn't care for him.
What? Come on, man. He helped write the Honky Tonk Man's theme song. How could you not like him?
You know what I mean, he was the manager for, like the biggest baby face of all time, Hulk Hogan. But he was always a heel. Like, you never looked at Jimmy Hart and thought he
for
was
the most
baby
part,
face.
he was. Jimmy did turn face a little bit towards the end of his '93 run, or his original WWE run, towards the end of '93 when he kind of joined Hogan and Brutus Beefcake as the Mega Maniacs. If you guys remember that at all?
I don't remember that.
Very little.
Beefcake is one of the worst too.
I actually remember him mostly as a babyface manager. I don't remember him as a heel manager all that much.
I remember him being with Hogan, for a long time. But even when he was with Hogan, I still considered him a heel. He was always the bad guy, even when Hogan was the good guy. It was like,
Yeah, I was going to say, I remember him with Hogan, and I'm like, the one person in all of wrestling that literally does not need a manager.
Well, I mostly remember him as a heel. I first remember him mostly with the Hart Foundation as their manager, and then once Honky Tonk Man came in, and then I also remember him as the manager for the Fabulous Rougeau brothers when they would come out waving their little American flags and had that All American Boys theme song to basically get the crowd to shit on them, which was always great. And then, of course, I remember him as the manager of the Mountie as well. If you remember that gimmick.
Yeah, I actually do remember the Mountie.
Yeah. I believe that was Jacques Rougeau as the Mountie, if I remember correctly. But I also remember when they teamed them with, I believe it was Carl Ouellet, and they were the Quebecers. If you remember that tag team as well.
No.
Okay. To go on a bit of a tangent, you mentioned you always thought of Jimmy as a heel, even when he was working with Hogan. But do you remember how much heel tactics Hogan would use, even when he was like the super baby face?
Yeah, he did.
It always annoyed me later on whenever I would watch old wrestling.
He would always do that. No matter whether he was a babyface or not, he'd always do that like weird scared thing that the heels do,
Mm-hmm.
and like back away. I remember that a lot. Like he was a baby face when he would do that.
Or like when he would come into the Rumbles with his T-shirt and then use his shirt to choke guys, and I'm like, isn't Hogan supposed to be the baby face? Why is he choking people? Or like if he didn't get his way, it'd be like he'd bitch and complain like the heels, and it always made me laugh because Jesse Ventura and who was the other one? Bobby Heenan would point out how he was, being a little crybaby, and of course Gorilla Monsoon would have to defend him. He's like, no, he's all American, blah blah.
Well, honestly, I wonder how much of that was Hogan really bitching behind off camera if he didn't get his way.
Yeah. Well, Bruce Pritchard has come up with a term that Hogan must pose. So no matter what happened, that's how the night had to end. Hogan must pose.
Do you remember? One of the things I remember, Jimmy Hart, the big thing, had nothing to do with Hogan, but he was part of the Andy Kaufman, Jerry Lawler feud back in the early 80s. Do you guys remember that? They actually had matches that Jimmy Hart was part of, like actually wrestling with Andy Kaufman.
I actually don't remember those.
Those were like, yeah, he was like he was on the show with him and everything.
Kaufman. Well, I didn't know Hart was involved with it.
Yeah, Hart was like part of the original. He was part of. There was matches where Hart would get in the ring with Andy, and they would both fight Lawler at the same time. So like he was like I guess he was like Andy's half manager, half wrestling partner. It was, of course, that was a weird thing anyway. Freaking Andy Kaufman part of it, but it's probably one of the biggest wrestling things of all time.
Champion. Well, funny with Jimmy, one of the things I'll always remember is at WrestleMania 3, where he was managing Honky Tonk Man against Jake the Snake Roberts. And this was when they had a lot of celebrities involved, and Jake the Snake came out with Alice Cooper. And at the end of the match, Jake the Snake grabs his snake or he puts Hart in a full Nelson, and Alice goes and grabs the snake to put on Jimmy. And in real life, Jimmy Hart is definitely afraid of snakes. So he actually injured his neck with how much he was basically trying to strain to get out of the full Nelson to make sure that snake did not get anywhere near him. And I always thought that was pretty funny.
Well, I guess me and Jimmy actually have something in common
then. One other thing before we move on to the next person on the list is, Jimmy actually was part of a music group back in the 60s named the Gentrys. And he actually was the writer for the group. And, they had a somewhat hit back then. And he, as I mentioned earlier, he helped write a Honky Tonk Man's theme song, but he also helped write a lot of the other wrestlers' theme songs. Like he works side by side with Jim Johnson, who used to write all the theme songs, I believe. So he did end up writing like 20, 30 theme songs that were pretty popular, and some of the songs were actually rip-offs of popular hits. But he would change the tunes a little bit here and there just to make them sound differently enough so that they wouldn't get sued. But he did help, a lot with that.
He wrote The Real American, didn't he? Hogan's
Yeah,
big
he
theme
wrote
song.
Real American.
I thought he did. I have to say, like, the one thing, this is like a newer thing that happened. It was when Hogan and Ric Flair were at the Hall of Fame. I don't know how many years ago it was now, but they were both there and they like had their little standoff like backstage. And Jimmy Hart was there too. And I always remember that. And I was like, this is the perfect thing about Jimmy Hart that I always remember, because Ric Flair is like going on about Hogan and how if he's going to get in his face, and then and Jimmy Hart's like way off in the distance, and he just yells at Jimmy, and he's like, "Yeah, I'll smack the taste out of your mouth too, Jimmy Hart. Don't you open that mouth." And I was like, "That's how I feel about Jimmy Hart most of the time." So Ric Flair summed it up, and it was just out of nowhere.
All right. So moving on to our next person on the list, Paul Heyman, also known as Paulie Dangerously, back in the 90s. What can we say about Paul Heyman?
That hasn't already been said.
By him.
and by others, and not the nicest way. I'm sure there's still guys in ECW that he owes money to, probably.
Oh yeah. Surprised he didn't go to jail for all the bounce checks he wrote.
Yeah, it probably helped that it probably helps that his dad was a lawyer. But most of today's fans probably know him mostly as Brock Lesnar's manager. He's been his manager for about the last 8 years. Brock Lesnar is not the best guy on the mic, so it's good that you probably have one of the most best mic men in the business doing the talking for you. But like I said, most of us who grew up in the 90s know him as the owner / creator for ECW. I think we all kind of grew up in that time when ECW was really big. It was like the little engine that could.
And little did we know that he was getting paychecks from Vince.
Yeah, the whole time. The whole time. Yeah, I mean, Vince was basically funding it without people knowing.
That's great. Fund your competition, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
your pocket.
Yeah, I mean, whenever someone was kind of making it big, it'd be like Vince would be like, "Well, I'm going to take this guy and that guy," and most of us probably remember him from the early '90s too, when he was managing the Dangerous Alliance. Do you guys remember who was in that group at all?
No.
I want to say it was like Paul Orndorff, Rick Rude, Stunning Steve Austin, Arn Anderson, and maybe Barry Windham, if I remember correctly. And then, of course, everyone remembers his rivalry with Jim Cornette with the new Midnight Express versus the original Midnight Express. I believe Heyman and Cornette ended up having a tuxedo match or some shit, where supposedly they beat the shit out of each other for real because they hated each other.
See, I know. I mean, I know he was a manager back then, but I do not remember that at all. Any of it. Like, I do not remember Paul Heyman until ECW. Like, nothing before that. And the one day I was watching, just watching random YouTube videos and seen him managing Taker before he was Taker in WCW. And I was like, when? And I was more surprised that Paul Heyman was in WCW, then I was Taker. I was like, how do I not remember this? Like, I only watched WCW during this time, and I have no recollection of Paul Heyman being WCW.
Yeah, he did manage Undertaker back then. He was known as Mean Mark Callis.
Yeah.
But apparently, it was Ole Anderson basically told Mark Calloway that he couldn't do nothing with him, or that he wasn't really talented.
Yeah. Told him he'd never make anything of himself in the
off
business.
He went to WWE.
Good old Ole. He was always known for being such a compassionate and level-headed man.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Biggest dickhead in the business.
Absolutely.
That's what
Made
most
some of the
people
biggest
says about him.
mistakes too.
Yeah, I mean, I think no one's record is clean. Everyone let someone go that ended up becoming, just as Eric firing Austin via FedEx. It's crazy how that happened. Where Eric took like all the older guys, and Vince just took the younger guys who ended up carrying his company to victory, basically.
Yeah, old men can't compete the way a young man can. I mean, sooner or later those old guys are gonna peter out, and what are you gonna do with them then? I mean, Hogan. Everybody can still carry on their name, but when the matches aren't very good, nobody's gonna be watching them, and that's like 90% of the show is the matches.
Cornette used to have a segment. I cannot remember the segment's name, but he used to have a segment during the 90s. It was on WWF or WWE. It was one of their, it was like Last Night with Cornette or something like that. Or
I know what you're talking about. I don't remember the name of the segment either.
It was like a 10-minute shoot on whatever the competition was doing. And no one else better to do it than old Corny. And one of the things that I remember him saying about some of the stuff that Bischoff was doing cracked me up because it was true. It was like, well, last night on WCW, the wrestling retirement home just let out, and all the geriatrics came out.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite lines from that when they were doing that is Cornette said, Hogan is a household name, but so is garbage.
But I guess back to Heyman, because I'll say this about him. Damn sure don't ever trust him. But something is to be said for being the last manager standing, in my opinion. And he does fulfill a much needed role. Because oftentimes your managers were there to kind of not necessarily tutor, but help wrestlers who had a lot of potential along, because especially if they can't run a mic, if they can't talk or do anything well like that, you need a manager to be the mouthpiece for those guys. So that's why I was surprised to see some wrestlers, like I said earlier, why Hart was managing Hogan. I don't know, because Hogan, like, to me, is like the epitome of success in wrestling. That's the one person you really don't think needs a manager, but definitely
Hogan just needed someone to carry his weed.
But
I think that there was a few people, like, I never thought that Rick Rude needed a manager either.
Absolutely not.
But
because he was
like
a great mic runner.
He had multiple managers, and he had like some of the greatest managers of all time. But he never needed one.
But I like to think that role was always there to help a lot of those struggling wrestlers.
The thing that's kind of surprised me with Heyman is that I'm actually surprised that they haven't tried to use him more in this last run that he's had with Lesnar, and that I'm surprised they haven't had him try to make a stable of some sorts. He's managed a few other guys like here and there in the last 8 years, but it hasn't really lasted that long. Like he managed Cesaro for a couple months, and they had him manage Curtis Axel, who was Mr. Perfect's kid. That didn't last that long. That's mainly because Curtis Axel had some very big shoes to fill and was nowhere near as good as his dad. And then they put him with CM Punk for a while, even though CM Punk was one of those guys that didn't need a manager either. But that was more because they were actually friends in real life. So that was one of those things why they were together. But I'm surprised that they haven't tried to have him like form a team around Lesnar or anything like that.
I would say like one of the best things about, my opinion, in a manager is when you have a stable of heels and then you have a heel manager along with them. Even if they're all good on the mic, it's nice to have a heel just manager. I mean, when you had like last time I can really think of it that happened in continuation in wrestling was probably when you had like Vince with his stables, him being the ultimate heel there.
But you also had the Heenan family.
Well, I mean that's what I mean. I was like, the Vince is the last one I remember, like continuum wise, before they went Bobby. His lasted for a long time, but he was already over by then, just announcing.
All right, so number 3 on our list was Paul Bearer, most famous for being the manager of The Undertaker. I mean, there's no way you don't. If you think of The Undertaker, there's no way you don't think of Paul Bearer standing next to him. Also,
and manager of Kane.
Yeah, manager and daddy for Kane. His demon seed. Also managed Mankind and Vader for a while there, and part of the ministry and stuff like that. But I think he'll always be remembered for being manager of the Undertaker. Anyone that grew up with 70s and 80s probably remembers him as Percy Pringle, and I believe it was Houston and kind of the Von Erichs territory and stuff like that. But he, crazy thing, he was actually a real life mortician in life. Mm-hmm. So not only was he his gimmick, but it was his profession as well. Go ahead, Rocky.
I was just going to say, I know you can do it, Roland. Give us an impression of Paul Bearer. I know you can. I know you can do it.
Oh, dead man!
Oh yeah.
That squeaky ooh he did, like always, like I will remember that. I cannot imitate it, but that I will probably remember that to the day I die. That is like one of the best. He'd sit there and hold that iron up in the air as he made that noise.
Kane is here, dead man. I actually watched about an hour and a half of Paul Bearer today. I found it on YouTube. It was like an hour, almost like an hour and a half string of a lot of excerpts of him from the lead up, where him and Taker had a falling out, and the lead up and bring in of Kane. And then the whole Kane story arc all the way to where Kane turns on Paul Bearer, and I thought that was great because it really that is one man that he was just a hog for the spotlight almost.
He was really good in that role. Like you were just mentioning, the turn that he did on Undertaker, it was definitely something I don't think anyone saw coming at the
Oh
time.
yeah, he would wear the bandages and everything. It was great.
Yeah, it's kind of at the time when, well, it's around the time Mick Foley debuted as Mankind,
Mm-hmm.
and it was not like the white T-shirt wearing a goofy tie Mankind. It was
The
all
wearing
brown.
brown.
Yeah.
I think he called him. What do you call him? Uncle Bear, or he calls him
Uncle Paul.
Uncle Paul. Yep.
And I believe it was at SummerSlam '96. It was the Boiler Room Brawl between Undertaker and Mankind when Paul Bearer turned on him, and which led to the Buried Alive, and like you said, kind of it led to kind of like a 2-year storyline until they brought in Kane.
That was a great build-up too.
Yeah, it was like 6-7 months worth of build-up. Like you don't really see that in wrestling anymore. It's like everyone wants instant gratification, so.
Yeah, I think everyone has wrestling ADD anymore. It's like a story arc. If a story arc goes over like 2 or 3 months, it's like, whoa, that's forever.
Yeah, like just not to go super off topic, but think about when Miss Elizabeth left Randy Savage, and that was, during the whole Mega Powers explode situation. Like that was a whole year of built up for her to leave him, and then it was like 2 years worth of built up to get them back together. So you have a storyline that went like 3 years. Can you imagine a storyline nowadays going like 3 years long?
I can't imagine a storyline going a year long right now.
It's like, or,
well, you have a lot more like shows now too, though, so that plays into it.
Mm-hmm.
Like back then, you had a lot of like you'd have maybe one a week, and then you had a lot of like house shows that you weren't going to do any storyline in, like big storyline anyways. And then you had the pay-per-views, so like they had to like take longer to do storylines back then compared to now, where you got 2 shows a week, and then you got like the pay-per-views. They do a lot of shows now.
I guess back then too, pay-per-views were only like one every 3 to 6 months.
So when it first started, you would get like WrestleMania, and then in 1987 they introduced Survivor Series, and so now you had 2 a year, and then it was in '88 they introduced the Royal Rumble and SummerSlam. So then it was 4 a year for a while, and then in 1995 when Nitro started, it kind of led to if WCW is going to do 6 a year, so will we. And then it was like, yeah. So then WCW was like, well, we're going to do 8 a year, and they followed, and then it was 12, and then it was every month. But if you remember back then, whenever it wasn't Royal Rumble, WrestleMania, SummerSlam, or Survivor Series, those shows usually would be charged like $30, I think, to get those. Whereas any of the other pay-per-views that were not those 4 were like 15 or 20, since they were usually a little bit shorter and not, didn't have that big name value that, say, a WrestleMania would have.
Yeah, I remember paying $30 for WrestleMania.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, but to get back on topic, Paul Bear. The thing that always made me laugh with Paul Bear is how many times they probably killed him on screen.
Buried him in concrete.
Yeah, they buried him in concrete. I remember one time Austin threw him down the sewer,
Or
like head first down the sewer. Um, one of his last appearances was Edge shoving them into a meat locker and leaving them in there.
I was
And
wondering
then,
what the
go
last.
ahead.
I was wondering what was the last one. What was the final death of the character?
I think this is what it was. It was so Kane and Edge were feuding, and Edge shoved them into a meat locker, tied like in a computer chair, and then he was stuck in there for like during the duration of the show, and then Kane finally finds him, opens the meat locker, and Paul Bear's in there like crying and shit. And Kane just looks at him. He's like pathetic and just locks the freezer door. He's like, I'm like, we're done. And I want to say that was maybe his last appearance. But one of the awesome things is that after he passed away, they kind of included him in the storyline still.
Yeah, wasn't he supposedly in the urn or something like that?
Yeah, like he was cremated and they put him in the urn, and they had Undertaker did his usual entrance with the Druids, and one of the Druids ended up being CM Punk, who proceeded to burst the urn over Undertaker's head and just dump the ashes on top of Undertaker. Some people were pissed, but Paul Bear's own kids approved the storyline. So,
Oh yeah.
I always thought it was like, that's how you get heel heat, man.
And I could see him being all for that kind of story.
And then before I forget, CM Punk then picks up some of the ashes and just wipes it over his chest. That was a great WrestleMania match too, by the way. I would recommend seeing the Undertaker CM Punk match. So if you get a chance, check that out. Any other stories on Paul before we move on?
Not a whole lot. Just everything that I have ever heard mentioned about him was that he was just a genuinely really good dude. Like he was a super nice guy that everybody had ever met him had really nothing ever bad to say about it that I know of.
I've actually heard that too, that he was a really nice guy.
I think the only thing that is of a fun point, he used to call Undertaker Wendy behind
The
closed
red hair.
doors. Yeah, because of the red hair. Like apparently there would be a couple times where they'd have like a little bouts back and forth, not like major heat, but just the two going back and forth at each other because they had to be on the road together all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. It's kind of weird when Undertaker debuted, he had Brother Love as his manager.
Yeah.
That's always been weird to me. That it's always weird to not see Paul Bear next to him.
Yeah, Brother Love, like actually, he turned Undertaker over to Paul Bear. I remember that when he because Brother Love had that little show like on the, and he brought out Paul Bear and was like, I can't take care of the Taker the way he needs to be. And then he brought out Paul Bear and said that he was going to be his new manager.
Wow, it's like you kind of think of Paul Bear and Brother Love, very similar, but quite polar opposites of one another.
Yeah.
Taker
Yeah,
being with Brother Love doesn't seem like that should happen at all. Like I remember it, but I'm like, that doesn't seem like that was a mix that should be together. but but Paul Bear definitely seemed like he should have been with Taker.
Yeah. Brother Love actually made an appearance on screen a couple weeks ago during Money in the Bank this year. They actually had the wrestlers fight their way up WWE headquarters to get to the roof of the building to get the Money in the Bank briefcase. And at one point, they're fighting in like the bathroom, and Brother Love just comes out one of the stalls. And Rey Mysterio stops and looks at him, and Brother Love just like does the whole "I love you."
I love you.
And Rey Mysterio just like shrugs his shoulders and keeps the fight going. I thought it was hilarious. Just before we move on, one cool thing, Brother Love or Bruce Pritchard, he's the one that came up with the Kane storyline, and he says it's probably one of the it's his most favorite storyline that he came up with, to the point that his firstborn son is actually named Kane.
Huh.
All right, so I think we can move on to the next person.
Yeah.
Number 2. I know this is like Roland's favorite, probably. Jim Cornette.
Yeah, personally, Corny is my fave. One of my favorite managers of all time.
Yeah, so I'll let you take the lead a little bit here, Roland, since you know more about him than I do. I mostly know him for his WWF stuff.
Well, I don't know a whole lot of his WWF stuff, believe it or not. I know a little bit of it, but I grew up with WCW when he was managing here in the South, and actually he is a Louisville native, so the original Louisville Slugger, the original Mouth of the South, good old James E. Cornette. One of my favorite memories of Jim Cornette was when I first seen him. I think he was managing, I want to say, the Midnight Express. I think that's who he was managing at the time. They were going up against I want to say, the Rockers. And
the Rock and Roll Express.
Yeah. And it was one of my first ever experiences actually seeing a heel manager do what a heel manager should do, i.e., trip your opponents, hit them in the back, do whatever you have to do to draw, to win.
Yeah, he always had that tennis racket.
And believe it or not, that tennis racket was actually, there were nights he actually had that thing loaded with weights inside of it, because there were certain times they would draw so much heat at night. Jim's like, yeah, there's been a few people that have gotten the bad side of that racket. He's like, I will have to have it loaded. And by loaded, he means actually putting weights inside the zip up part of it. And he would just pop people in the face. They legit had to do that one night. I can't remember the story he was telling, but he was talking. He had to do that to get out because they had drawn so much heat that the police had to actually escort him out. A lot of people, he's a very divisive person. You either love him or you despise him. Now, Jim does not like a lot of modern wrestling. He shits all over it.
Yeah.
And I actually think that some of his points of view are very valid. He doesn't like a lot of the way the new guys wrestle. And in his opinion, the reason the reason he is that way is because he worries about their health. He's like, you guys do all this high spots, high spot, high spot, high spot, high spot. You're destroying your body. You are literally putting yourself out of a job at some point. You're going to be putting yourself out of a job sooner rather than later doing that. But he has managed all. He's also the only wrestling manager I know of that has managed Godzilla. There was I cannot remember the name of it, but TBS used to run a bunch of old Godzilla movies, like on Saturdays. And him and Jimmy Hart, it was during the build up to Godzilla versus King Kong. So they would snap back and forth and edit those two guys in, like commercial breaks and stuff, of just being wrestling managers, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. Which is another reason probably why I like him, because as a kid, and still as a adult, I love old Godzilla movies. So,
I mostly remember his gimmick was that of he was like a mama's boy, wasn't
he
he?
is.
Or something
He
like
is a
that.
rich mama's boy.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mostly remember him from like I said, from the WWF days, when he showed up around, I want to say like late '92, early '93, as the interpreter for Yokozuna. So like him and Mr. Fuji were kind of co-managing Yokozuna during his title reign.
Oh, one thing you may not know, Renee, something I just thought of. Actually, how Jim got in the business. Do you know how he actually got started in wrestling?
I may have heard the story before, but go ahead.
Jim has always been a fan of wrestling, and would oftentimes here in Louisville would go to the Gardens and try to watch whatever he could. He actually got in early on. I think it was. I want to say he had learned how to do tape trade. I don't know if it was tape trading or if it was. He was back then. You would have to have antennas to pick up a lot of closed circuit radio, or not radio, television, and he was in on that, trying to figure that out. But what really got him in the actual wrestling business was photographs. He started going down to ringside and taking pictures for the wrestlers, and would, he got to know the guys eventually, and through doing that, eventually got through to where he could go backstage and actually get into the business.
It's kind of surprising you having said that, because that's how Paul Heyman got his start too, as well as Bruce Pritchard.
Yeah. It's kind of funny how a lot of the old guys actually got their foot in the door. Do you guys remember when he, his big, I think it was in Starrcade, was it Starrcade 87? Where he took the dive off the scaffolding?
Oh, yeah. It was either 87 or 88. Was it Big Bubba Rogers was supposed to catch him?
Yeah, supposed to catch him. That's
for those who don't know, Big Bubba Rogers went on to be the big boss man in WWF. But you know what? It had to be 87, because I'm pretty sure Boss Man was in WWE by 88. Because during some show, he told Jim Cornette, like, "Hey, I just got an offer to go to New York, and they want me to work with Hogan." And I guess Jim Cornette basically looked him right in the face and said, "Why the fuck are you still standing here? Like, get your ass to New York."
Yeah.
He said, you know how much money you're gonna make working with Hulk Hogan?" He said, "Get your ass out of here."
And one thing he is known for, he's also known for his creative language. We'll put it. Jim is a very well-spoken man. As a Southern, he's also known for a couple of things: his outright, utter detestment and hatred of Vince Russo.
Yes.
So bad that a few years ago, I think Vince actually filed a restraining order on him.
So, for those who don't watch Dark Side of the Ring, there's a bit in there where Jim Cornette says that he hates Vince Russo so much that the day Vince Russo dies, Jim Cornette's wife, no matter how old Jim Cornette is at this point, when this day comes, his wife has to take him to Vince Russo's grave site so that he could piss on the grave. And he has said that if his wife does not do this, then that is grounds for divorce.
And you know what? I can get behind that amount of hatred. I sympathize with that. I understand that level of hatred.
Yeah.
Some people just piss you off to that point, and he frickin' detests that man.
Yeah, apparently the producers of Dark Side of the Ring also, they asked both of them, what would it take for us to put you guys in the same room together? And Jim Cornette said he won't do it. He says he knows for a fact that if he ever stepped into the same room with Vince Russo, he says he has no idea what would happen because he knows he'll go in a blind rage to the point where he might actually end up killing the motherfucker.
There have been some podcast cuts I used to have of Jim going on one of his epic rants where he just literally on air just threatened the dude, just like, if you ever come near me. Shortly thereafter, he was hit with a restraining order from Vince Russo.
Yeah. You got any stories, Rocky?
The only thing, I only semi remember Cornette as a manager, I will say. Where I remember Jim Cornette from mostly is from Ohio Valley Wrestling.
Yep.
Like in the, I guess, late 90s and early 2000s. When they started broadcasting that, I guess, I don't know if it was broadcast nationally or not. It may have just been broadcast locally around here. But I watched it like almost every week. And Cornette did like most of the announcing on it as well, as basically ran the thing. And that's where I mostly remember him from. I don't really, it's sad that I don't remember him from back in the early 90s and 80s when he was a manager, because I remember the racket, but it's like, it's weird that I don't remember a lot of that stuff back then. But
he ended up getting fired from Ohio Valley Wrestling for, if I remember correctly, one of the wrestlers, if you guys remember Santino Marella, there was one point where the character of the Boogeyman came out and everyone was supposed to scatter, and Santino Marella, kind of being new to the business, just started bursting out laughing instead of being scared or whatever. And apparently Jim Cornette went up and slapped the fuck out of him. And that was pretty much his last day with WWF, because they were like, yeah, you can't just go up to someone and slap them just because that's not how things work. Although I will say his last WWE appearance was actually not that long ago. He was actually brought in to do the induction for the Rock and Roll Express.
Yeah.
During the Hall of Fame, and the very first thing out of his mouth was, "Hell must have froze over." Who would have, he said, I don't know how safe it is to give me a live mic, but here we go.
I remember when that happened because he was real hush hush about that. He did not say a word leading up to that he was going to be on television. Apparently, when he got in there, he was really suspect when he got up there. He's just like, what kind of shit am I walking into? And when he met with Vince, he was like, all right, here it goes. Because, apparently he hated being in Connecticut. He hated a lot of his time there. He was, by the time his contract had expired, he was clawing and chomping at the bit to go home. So he was expecting a rough reunion when he went in. And apparently Vince looked at him and said, hey, Jim, been a long time. Welcome home. How you doing? And immediately he was kind of, I guess, off taken by that, shook Vince's hand, and bygones have been bygones with him. Now he'll still critique the product, and a lot of people, including myself, listen to his podcast. Like I said, he shits on a lot of things, but part of me thinks he's just shooting. Jim's just being Jim, just for the sake of it, because that's what he's known for.
One, I just wanted to touch upon one thing you just said, Roland, is, I know Vince McMahon gets shitted on a lot, but one thing I've always heard from a lot of people is if he thinks he can make business, as long as he thinks, he can make business with you, he'll give you unlimited chances.
Oh yeah, as long as you haven't burned him too bad, then from what I gather, he's pretty forgiving. I mean, he even let Jesse Ventura come back on a couple episodes, and those.
I mean, when you think about it, Jesse, Bruno Sammartino, Bret Hart, Ultimate Warrior, all those guys ended up coming back.
Except Macho Man. Macho, yeah, the only exception.
Yeah. So, all right. So moving on. Before we reveal number one, I figured we'd go through some honorable mentions. We'll try not to spend too much time on these guys. But let's see. We got Teddy Long. I mostly remember him from the late 90s when he was like a referee. But I do remember him being manager for like Mark Henry, Rodney Mack, Jazz, and stuff like that when he was kind of doing like a all black stable. And even though he never managed them, I've always heard that he basically always traveled with the APA. Does anyone else have anything to add about him real quick?
Well, Teddy Long was actually, I put him on my list. I loved Teddy Long when he was managing Mark Henry. And anytime that he would come out and just like, where my play is at, or he would come out and push some like huge dude and be like, hold on a minute, player.
I remember him as the general manager of SmackDown, and I go one-on-one with the Undertaker.
I remember that.
Yeah. All right. Moving on. Ted DiBiase as a manager. After his in-ring career ended around '93, he went on to manage the $1 Million Corporation and then the New World Order.
NWO.
As far as a manager goes, I think I just remember him like, he had the whole everyone's got a price. So the storyline that I always remember was when he got Tatanka to turn on Luger because Tatanka sold out or whatever. And then, of course, the Lawrence Taylor versus Bam Bam Bigelow match at WrestleMania, where it was like his guys versus the NFL team. Any other stories you guys might have about him as a manager?
Not as a manager. I've heard a couple of as a wrestler, but not as a manager.
All right. Moving on then. Honorable mention to sensational Sherry Martel. Let's start with you, Roland. I know she was on your list.
She was on my list. She had not only was she a wrestler, she had begun to become more, in my opinion, a manager and not necessarily a valet. A lot of times, women wrestlers who get into that are oftentimes just relegated to valet. And I thought Sherry done a lot more than that. She had such a huge personality. Let's see, she was a wrestler. She was a manager of Shawn Michaels when she was known as, I think it was Scary Sherry.
Possibly.
And then I remember her with I think it was the Harlem Heat. She done a brief stint managing them, and she also managed Macho Man when he was the Macho King.
The sensational Queen Sherry.
The sensational Queen Sherry. So I think a lot of times she just gets overlooked, in my opinion, when you start talking about managers, because it is primarily a male-driven position. And I think she actually stood out, especially in the 90s, in the early 90s with Shawn and Shawn Michaels. She done such a fantastic job. And her personality, in my opinion, was just over the top. Like when you seen her, that she was larger than life. That's just my opinion of her.
Yeah, like you said, right after Savage turned heel, he took her on as his manager. So I always remember those, promos with her standing there with Savage, and if you remember Zeus.
Oh my God. A fictional character that they brought out of a movie into like, what the hell? That was the
No
dumbest.
holds barred.
Yeah, that was like but Hogan was still Hogan. He wasn't the character that he was in the movie.
Yeah. He was Rip. Anyway, after she turned on Savage, she went on to manage Ted DiBiase, and then as you mentioned, Roland, Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels actually wrote in his book where he said that he knew he was about to get a push or start going to the main event when they put her as his manager. Because up to that point, she had only been with main event guys like Savage and DiBiase. A little bit after that, she was kind of let go. Ended up in WCW as Sensuous Sherry. I guess WWF had trademarked sensational.
They are pretty notorious about their trademarking of names.
Mm-hmm. And then, like you said, she managed Harlem Heat. I think everyone remembers the Hogan, "We coming for you."
Oh, the infamous
yeah, the infamous Booker moment.
Yeah.
She was standing there in the background, and you could just, as soon as Booker says it, and he's like, "Damn it!" You just see Sherry. You kind of just see Sherry kind of like console him, like, "They'll be all right." The next one, she's kind of more of a valet, but Miss Elizabeth, she was really big. She's a big part of the Randy Savage character. I mean, there's no way you don't think of Randy and Elizabeth together. and she also helped. She was also the reason the Mega Powers exploded because Hogan had lust in his eyes.
She was also part of that whole like uh sensational Sherry and Zeus debacle too. That was all
Yeah.
she was in part of that.
And I mean, it goes without saying, she was like the first lady of wrestling then.
Yep.
She was.
It's kind of a shame that they haven't put her in the Hall of Fame. But I'm sure she'll be in there one day. This guy was on your list too, Roland, was Mr. Fuji.
Yep. Mr. Fujiwara. He had managed the demolition.
Yeah, Demolition was big.
I'm
The
surprised
Powers
they're
of
not in
Pain.
the Hall of Fame yet.
It probably has to do with the current lawsuit that they have against WWF.
That's probably a good reason.
Yeah.
Also, Yokozuna.
Yeah, I managed Yokozuna. Apparently, he was known for being a big ribber in the company. Yeah. Do you guys remember something in the Attitude Era where Boss Man kidnapped Al Snow's dog? Do you guys remember this at all?
I do not remember that.
Not off the top of my head, no.
So Boss Man kidnapped Al Snow's dog, and decides to, as the weeks go on, Al Snow's worrying, and Boss Man keeps attacking him, keeps like dangling the dog or whatever inside a pet carrier or whatever, trying to get Al Snow. And one day, Boss Man is like, you know what? I'm gonna give you your dog back, and invites him to his hotel room and starts feeding him some food, and then ends up telling him like, I'm feeding you your dog. I killed your dog, and I'm now feeding him to you. It led to like one of the stupidest matches in the history of WWF. It's called the Kennel from Hell match. Unforgiven 99 for anyone who wants to see it. It's fucking horrible. It's basically Hell in a Cell, but surrounded by dogs who were more interested in sniffing each other and fucking than trying to bite Al Snow or Boss Man. But the reason I brought up this story is because apparently, rumor has it that Mr. Fuji did this to a neighbor that he disliked. He kidnapped his neighbor's dog and then fed it to that guy.
Oh my God.
Apparently Bruce Pritchard has confirmed this story, but that's where they got the idea for that storyline.
Damn.
I also I don't watch a lot of 70s wrestling and stuff like that, but he was also tag team partners with Professor Toru Tanaka.
Yes.
Who did a couple of movies with like Chuck Norris and all that.
Yeah, he as a manager, his whole gimmick was he looked and acted a lot like Odd Job.
I was gonna say that's what I always thought of him as, an Odd Job.
And I always remember the Salt.
Is that who Tanaka played? Because he was in the James Bond movie, wasn't he too?
I don't know.
All right. I have one more honorable mention. Vicky Guerrero. She, after Eddie passed away, it seemed like they just brought her in to kind of help her out, with the kids and with her kids and stuff like that. But she ended up being a very great performer in her own way, and she managed Chavo for a while, but I think she'll mostly be known for the for managing Edge for a while there when Edge had like the most heel heat you could, yeah, like nuclear heat.
Yeah, she was
But
a really good
she
heel
was
manager. I
definitely
will say
very
that.
charismatic.
She
What's
was a
up?
very good. She was a very good heel. Like
She was.
you really like
She
to hate
was.
her.
As great as Eddie was as a wrestler, she was as that character. Um, just yelling "excuse me" and stuff like that. I mean, she had more heat than some of the guy wrestlers there, man. Um, but those are our honorable mentions. So moving to our number one. If you've watched any of our previous WrestleCasts, you probably already know who this is.
I was going to say you should not be surprised by this.
But Bobby the Brain Heenan, um, greatest manager of all time, man. I'll let you start, Rocky. You got any stories?
We've talked about him so much on this podcast already. He's just the greatest of all time. Like there is nothing, like nobody can compete with him. I don't. I still think he's like up there as like one of the greatest announcers of all time too. He's just everything about him, even the words he made up, like because he made up tons of words for things, uh, played into his character, and he was such a good heel. I have to say he's pretty much the ultimate heel, and I mean we even talked about it before how he was such a good heel that when Jim Cornette came out, all Bobby Heenan had to do was announce him as his friend, and everybody instantly hated Cornette. I mean, that is like you're a freaking good heel if you can just announce somebody and they instantly become a heel too.
Yeah, he was definitely a heat magnet, man. Um, yeah, like we said, what could we possibly say that we already haven't said about him? Honestly, when you think of a Mount Rushmore of wrestling, he's up there with all those guys that were main eventers because you know he you know he was such a big part of the 80s and 90s wrestling. He you know all those main events that Hogan had at WrestleManias, chances are that the other guy on the other side of the ring, had probably had Bobby Heenan there as their manager. Whether it was King Kong Bundy or Andre or DiBiase or you know, um, and he managed so many guys to different titles. I would say the only thing that you know one negative I would maybe say is unfortunately he never led anyone to the world title, really, kind of. I mean, Andre beat Hogan, and then he basically handed the title over to DiBiase, who then was stripped of the title. That's about the closest he ever came to having one of his heel wrestlers be the world champion. Um,
Well, he had Flair when he brought him in and said he was the true world champion. Remember that?
Yep,
that's
that's true.
that's true, but I think by that point, Bobby said he was a little burnt out, and I think it was like he went to Vince and was like, I can't do these nights anymore, like with Flair. So that's why you mostly ended up with Mr. Perfect being the manager for Flair. since he kind of had his back injury going on, and Bobby was more of a consultant for Flair. But yeah, I mean, at this point, Bobby's been on our greatest announced teams. He's been he tops this list. You know. What about you, Roland?
I mean, there's not a lot we can say that hasn't already been said. Like you said, at the he's up there with all main eventers on a quote unquote Mount Rushmore of wrestling. And the reason being is Bobby is a main eventer in his own right. He would draw more heat. People would line up around, would pack stadiums just to watch him get beat. Somebody would put him in a weasel costume and then wail on him. People would just line up to watch that. And it's very difficult to get that kind of heat. Just being you. Articulate, well-spoken, a true wrestling or managerial mastermind, in my opinion. And quite honestly, his personality is larger than life. He literally was the epitome of a heel manager. And even so much that he could take that heat, that personality, and then just put it behind a seat behind a microphone, and instantly success. That's an achievement. And for Bobby to be anywhere but number one, to me, is almost ludicrous. But like we said, he's larger than life at this point.
Kind of to touch on what Rocky said, just by being associated with him, you were automatically a main eventer.
Oh yeah.
Or very high mid card wrestler.
Yeah, I mean, I remember him being him managing Mr. Perfect
and
Rick Rude, and
I loved when he managed Mr. Perfect, and Mr. Perfect would throw the towel behind him, and Bobby would catch it behind his back.
Yeah.
You know, he, like you said, there's just so much to say. Like you said, if he was your manager, you know, you were either main event or near the top of the main event. Rick Rude was pretty high up there. You know, honestly, there's only maybe one or two guys that I could think of that they kind of stuck him with that probably didn't do anything. One being the Brooklyn Brawler for some reason. And the other is the Red Rooster. If you remember that shit gimmick.
We all can't be winners.
They can't all be winners. There's a funny story with that is, you know, they call it the box of gimmicks or whatever. So apparently they had hired Terry Taylor and they had hired Kurt Hennig, and one of them was going to be Mr. Perfect and the other one was going to be the Red Rooster. And apparently Kurt got to the meeting first or something. So, you know, this is all rumor, and you know, but apparently Kurt got to the meeting first and picked Mr. Perfect.
Shouldn't have stopped for gas, man.
Yeah. Terry Taylor sucks anyway. It's terrible. But any final words before we close the show out?
You know, I would just like to say that you know, I mean, we did talk about Miss Elizabeth, but is it just me, or is a manager can only really be a heel. Like I know you've had some managers that pull off the baby face, but only sometimes. And then, but mostly, if you're a manager, you're a heel, and I think it plays along with the characters that usually need. Because I mean, if you put it like most people that needed managers back in the day needed managers because they wouldn't get on the mic, and it's much easier to be a bad guy if you're not good on the mic because you don't say anything, so you just go in and wrestle in the ring, get out. So. uh, So maybe that's why one of the reasons the managers have died off over the years. Of course, wrestling's changed so much over the years with all the shows, and now, well, not what it used to be. But it's just it just seems like a manager is a heel no matter what, and that's what we think of them as.
I would agree with that.
Well, there is one manager I was while we were going over everything that kind of popped in my head, and I know we didn't mention. But since I agree with you, Rocky, most of your managers and your more memorable ones, and in my opinion, your more successful managers have all been heel managers because there's just, to me, there's just so much more that they can do and become memorable in that role by doing those things. But as on the counter note, a babyface manager, I think, would be Captain Lou Albano.
Okay, yeah, I'll agree with you on that. He was definitely a babyface.
Yeah, and I thought he done what he could. He was never my favorite manager, but the big thing I remember him was when he was with Cyndi Lauper during that early '80s.
Do you guys remember? Do you guys remember him being Super Mario?
I was getting ready to say, and as Mario, yeah.
During the live bits of the cartoon.
That show is on Netflix, and I've been watching it with my kid, and it's still just as good as I remember. You see Captain Lou as Mario
Brothers Super Show.
All right, then. So I guess this brings us to the end of the episode. I hope everyone enjoys it. In a few weeks, we should be releasing a little bit more content, but hopefully we'll be having some mini episodes and stuff like that coming for you guys soon. But other than that, I am Renee, and thanks for listening, and have a good night, everyone.
Later, everybody.
Stay safe. Stay healthy.